Welcome to the Method Dungeon Awards, Battle for Azeroth Edition. I'm your host, Dratnos, and in this video, I'm going to be handing out several prestigious awards to the dungeons this expansion. I'll also give my opinion on the good and bad things that have changed about dungeons this expansion, but keep in mind that my views are my own, and it's fine to disagree with them, so definitely get into the comments section and let us know what you think. Our first award, Best Trash Area, goes to Kragmaw the Infested's room in the Underrot. This is my favorite area in any Battle for Azeroth dungeon. It's full of a bunch of mobs that you can choose to pull in pretty much any order, and they all have abilities that need to be handled, but they can be handled in many different ways. It's a room that really rewards creative groups, and it can be handled through either solid pre-planning or skillful improvisation. One nice feature of this room is the presence of living rot enemies. These are basically filler enemies that, unlike the other enemies in the room, don't require you to directly interact with them. That's one of the big changes between Legion and BFA dungeons. There are far fewer filler enemies. Most mobs in dungeons now require an interrupt, a stun, or they do something to your group if the tank isn't in melee range, or they put out a dispellable effect. This can be overwhelming. I do think it's mostly a good thing, though maybe it could be toned down a little bit, and it's been part of the reason that BFA has been so unfriendly to ranged. With so many interrupts required, you're often only able to pull multiple packs at the same time if you have 3 or even 4 melee cooldown kicks. Going into Shadowlands, I'd love to see a rebalance of ranged and Mythic Plus. Giving them a shorter cooldown kick would obviously solve the problem, although there's, PvP balance issues with that. Also, it would be solvable by reducing the amount of abilities that need to be interrupted, and instead adding more that require other forms of interaction. Up next is the prestigious Best Clip Award, which goes to Now for this wonderful Toldagor clip showing off the truly impressive Unholy Death Knight rotation. Incredible. The next award is for the dungeon with the best theme, and this was a close race. This expansion's dungeons have hit a very high standard in terms of art and flavor, but my personal favorite is Freehold. The strong pirate theme, reinforced by mechanics that feel piratey, the fantastic voice lines.
Cannons! Blast these scurvy dogs to bits! Men! Acquaint these scallywags with our heavy guns!
And the incredibly creative and ridiculous design of a Shark Puncher boss. Really everything came together to make this one of WoW's all-time greatest dungeons thematically. Up next is the Best Boss Award, which again had some fairly intense competition. I'll start by talking about some runners-up. Trothak the Shark Puncher, for its excellent theme and the way the mechanics intuitively made sense, would have done well if it weren't for the encounter being plagued with some very frustrating bugs that to this day haven't all been fixed. For me, that's disqualifying. Mechgineer's Garden, the second to last boss of Mechagon Workshop, has also been a personal favorite of mine. It's full of harsh but dodgeable mechanics, and I love the way that it ramps up over time. Unfortunately, it's fairly unfriendly to ranged players, and in high tyrannical keys, as the boss starts to live for more than 3 minutes, it can become a little too much. My other honorable mentions are Yasma and the last 2 bosses of Waycrest Manor, but the winner of this award is the Sand Queen, the first boss of Toldagor. I love how this boss has a huge ceiling for player skill in high keys, as the upheaval ability offers a tiny window where movement abilities can dodge it. Its damage was also recently nerfed, so it's now possible for some classes that can't dodge it to survive with externals or personal defensives. It also scales well down to lower keys, where the upheaval is no longer threatening as a one-shot, but hitting the rest of the group with it is still bad, and dodging sand traps while spreading out is also important. This boss tests movement, throughput, and smart usage of both offensive and defensive cooldowns, and aside from being picked 3 times in a row by Upheaval, it's a fair boss where generally, if you die, you could have done something better. This is also a boss where all 3 roles, tank, healer, and DPS, have important jobs to do, and all get tested. The next award is for Buggiest Dungeon, and the winner, by a landslide, is Toldagor. At various times this expansion, these items and abilities have had the potential to bug out this dungeon, and many of them still do. They can pull through the walls, through the floors, through the ceilings, and knockback effects can send mobs hurtling through the floor down to the next level, where they'll pull all the enemies down there, that'll either run up the stairs and come kill you, or sometimes they'll just melee you through the floor and kill you that way. It seems like the core problem is thin walls and thin ceilings, so a little bit more space between the floors in a vertical dungeon like this would probably have gone a long way, and also just making them, thicker would also go a long way. It would also fix the awful nameplates that many players encounter in Tol Dagor if the levels had more space between them. Our next award is another bad one, Worst Tuned Trash Mob. An honorable mention goes out to the reanimated honor guards in Ataldazar. One alone is enough to make a pull difficult, but for some reason there are multiple groups in this dungeon that have 2 of these enemies. The throughput required to get through these pulls is comparable to a normal pull if the key were like 5 levels higher. And one of these pulls is in a choke point, which basically requires you to have a rogue for Shroud, or to lose time with a worse skip. Awaken doesn't even solve this problem in this dungeon, as the other double honor guard pull is right next to one of the obelisks. It's a mess. But it pales in comparison to the nightmare that is the Shadow of Zul. In a tyrannical key, this mini-boss hits harder than the bosses in the dungeon, and when fortified is active it does become a nightmare. Though some tank specs can self-heal through it, many have no option but to save all their defensives and hope their healer can keep them up. And in high keys, this often devolves into a death run. Also, for some reason, this is the only mob in the entirety of BFA dungeons, bosses included, that has a frontal parry arc. Alright, with those rants out of the way, let's go to our final award, the most prestigious one. The award for Best Tuned Dungeon goes to the Underrot. This is a dungeon that has difficult enemies, both trash and bosses, but after a few balance changes, nothing really feels unfair in here. Most affixes are impactful, but none of them are impossible in here, in the way that, say, bolstering is in Siege of Borealis. None of them are free either, though. Even affixes like Volcanic are actually at their hardest in here, where they start to spawn a lot on the last boss. This dungeon offers a nice amount of choice in terms of what to pull, and is a great example of how a linear dungeon should look, contrasted to, say, King's Rest or Temples to Thrallus, where there are very few options with your route besides choosing what to skip. Overall, BFA dungeons have had their ups and downs, but I've had fun playing in them, and I'm excited to see what comes next in Shadowlands. In addition to the stuff I mentioned during the various awards, I think there are a few specific things that they shouldn't carry forward into Shadowlands. In Waycrest Manor, there's a random door open at the start, and there are weekly rotating witch spawns, both of which I feel add too many layers of RNG and difference from run to run. Much like corruption effects on gear, I think there is a place for dungeon runs to be different from each other, but when there are too many things that can be different from run to run, it starts to become overwhelming. In Siege of Borealis, the Alliance have had a much harder dungeon for the entirety of BFA. Their trash at the start is much tougher, and they have 30 seconds of extra waiting time at the end of the dungeon for a gate to open while it immediately opens for the Horde. I think the dungeons being slightly different for different factions, covenants, or whatever can work, but it's important that it's balanced and that they check in on the balance every so often, instead of leaving Alliance Siege of Borealis in the state it's been in for 2 years. Finally, the seasonal affixes. I feel like Awakened has been good so far, and I also liked Reaping, but both Beguiling and Infested were really draining. Both of them were on weekly rotations that added another layer to the things that can be different in any given dungeon list that I mentioned before, and it felt like a badly placed emissary or infested enemy really shut down your group's options and forced you to pull in a very specific way. Beguiling was the worst offender here, where really 11 of the 12 weeks were pretty bad because they had one bad affix or a bad Beguiling pattern, and that was enough to make the week so much worse than the 1 week where everything lined up nicely. Awakened, by contrast, instead of narrowing down our options with what we could pull, has instead expanded them, and I hope that that's the model they use for seasonal affixes in Shadowlands. Those are my thoughts about the state of dungeons, but I'd love to hear yours. Let us know in the comments what you think, and what you hope changes or stays the same going into Shadowlands. Remember to like and subscribe to catch all the great content here on the Method YouTube channel. Thanks everybody for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.